This is, I think, the 7th in our series, and today we'll be discussing immigration policy. So why do we do this? At the library, the Monterey County Free Library's mission is to bring ideas, inspiration, information, and enjoyment to the community. We are also increasingly community hubs and meeting places, each one of our libraries. So in these times when any disagreement results in hyper-partisanship rather than serious informed discussion, our mission of bringing ideas and information becomes more important than ever. So we will be discussing various topics over the next few months and topics of current interest, and what we try to do is talk with leaders and policymakers in our community and authorities on the specific topics. Our previous discussions have been very, very well received. I understand there's a couple of accidents. I'm hoping we'll have more people walk in. But thank you all. It's just traffic? Yeah, okay. Well, hopefully people will get here, and especially as the discussion heats up. But we have a very engaged audience, I can tell. So here we have some ground rules. This is for our panelists and also for the audience. The focus here is always on civility and hearing opinions. So we request all audience members, please respect that, and please respect the opinions of our panelists. We may not agree, but we will not be disagreeable. Our focus today will be on policy, not on politicians. And I really want to stress this has been an issue over and over in recent times. We really lose track of the policies. We tend to get very focused on personalities, so we try to stay away from that. We will use a question and answer format. I will ask the questions to the panelists individually or as a group. In order to cover as much ground as possible and to give everyone a chance to be heard, we do request that panelists keep their answers to about 2 to 3 minutes. Try not to go too long. And we also don't necessarily ask all the panelists the same questions. We might, select 1 or 2 of you. The audience will have time to ask the panelists questions at the end. So please hold all your questions, your comments till the end. And in the past, what we've done is have people write them, but we're a very small audience. We won't do that today. The other thing I just want to point out is, of course, the restrooms are outside and to your left. That's very important information. I hope all of you signed in. It is important for us. We like to keep track of how many people have come. You don't have to use your real name. You can just sign in. We need a head count, basically. And then our panelist, Jeff Korman, did bring an essay, a copy of his essay, which is out by the front. If you haven't picked one up, I do encourage you to pick it up. And thank you for doing that. We really do appreciate it. And with that, we will go ahead and introduce our panelists. On my extreme left is Kelly Watts. Kelly has been practicing employment-based immigration law for 26 years. She has practiced all aspects of immigration law over those years, including family-based immigration, removal defense, violence against women, and asylum. For the past 15 years, her practice has focused on employment-based immigration only. Her company is the only employment-based, all-women immigration firm in Santa Cruz County, Monterey County, and all the way down to San Luis Obispo. Yay! Her passion is working with entrepreneurs and startups, but also in helping both small and large businesses understand their rights and obligations with respect to I-9 compliance, hiring, firing, and ICE raids. Then next is Supervisor Luis Alejo. Supervisor Alejo was elected in June 2016 to represent District 1 on the Monterey County Board of Supervisors and currently serves as the board chair. He has had an illustrious career in politics, having worked as mayor in his hometown of Watsonville, and in 2010 he became the youngest legislator to be elected to represent our 20th Assembly District in Sacramento. During his 6 years in the Assembly, he authored numerous landmark pieces of legislation, including the bill to raise the minimum wage to the highest level in the country, AB 10, and to allow undocumented immigrants to obtain valid California driver's licenses, AB 60. Supervisor Alejo is a proud descendant of migrant farm workers who came here in the 1950s and the son of a Vietnam-era veteran of the United States Army. Next we have Jeff Korman. Jeff was born and raised in Monterey, where he maintains his consulting business. Jeff majored in political science at UC Berkeley, focusing on industrial policy in the post-Cold War era. Before finishing at Berkeley, Jeff worked at several hotels and restaurants in the food and beverage industry. And I understand he knows several people. He serves as a volunteer with the Monterey County. Jeff recently published an essay to show goodwill when working on citizenship, residency, and the census. And that was the essay I was talking about, and it's a really nicely written piece. I hope you all will all take a look at it. And right here, next to me, is Vince Kohler. Vince is a political scientist and a sociologist who works for Social Policy Research Associates, a think tank in Oakland. For the last 20 years, he has worked nationally on education and workforce policy for the U.S. Department of Labor, Education, Justice, and Housing and Urban Design, as well as many states and local communities. He grew up in Switzerland. He graduated with an MA in International Policy Studies from the Monterey Institute of International Studies, now the Middlebury Institute of International Studies, which brought him to California. He has lived on the Monterey Peninsula for more than 30 years. He became a citizen in 2002 and has been active in politics since then. He was the chair of the Monterey County Democratic Party from 2006 to 2016. And thank you all so much for agreeing to be here. And before we start, I also want to say full disclosure, I myself am an immigrant. I'm also a citizen. I have lived in the United States much longer than I actually lived in my home country, but none of this is personal. We are talking about policies, and we are talking about US policies. So one of the things we like to do is always start off by trying to find common ground among our panelists. So here's the first question. People on both sides of the issue of immigration can generally give strong justification for their opinion. Can each one of you state one way in which immigrants can benefit the US, and one way in which you think they could have a negative impact on the US?
A way in which immigrants currently benefit the US clearly is, I think, that there's very little debate among people who study this, economists, that immigrants have a tremendous economic beneficial effect on the US. So I think that's a clear benefit. Both immigrants are more likely to start businesses, they're more likely to own businesses, they're more likely to employ others than native-borns. So there are clear beneficial effects. They also pay, both documented and undocumented immigrants pay into our Social Security and all the other benefits, taxes and so forth, and they actually pay more than they take out. So I think there's a clear benefit. I think the biggest risk that immigrants pose, in a way, is a political risk. So, and we see that in this country, and we see it in Europe right now, which is that if immigration is perceived to not be handled in a way that the majority tolerates, then governments can very quickly run the risk of kind of losing stability. And so I think, I don't think that's the immigrants' fault per se, but I think that is actually something that poses a risk to a society from immigration. And again, I can't blame immigrants for that, but I do think it's a risk for a democratic society.
Thank you.
Well, I think there are many benefits and many, I don't know if you asked risks or costs.
Just the positive and the negative, and you don't have to have both.
So, well, I do.
Yeah.
There's two that I'd like to point out very briefly. One is, it's been very good for this country in national security to have people from all over the world here, whether it's Native Americans talking their language in code that the Japanese couldn't figure out, or the Sicilians that were here in California when we went to invade Europe. We started with Sicily during World War II. So there are benefits to cultural diversity, no doubt about it. And individuals, when they come here, can bring tremendous energy. There are a lot of studies saying that new immigrants work very, very hard. There's also, talking about the cost, there's studies that say the second generation, I don't like generalities, but statistically, the second generation often has mixed identity issues, not as much loyalty to America, and criminal problems that are pretty serious. Then on the cost side, if you think of Native Americans here in isolation, they really didn't run the risks of European diseases until the Europeans started immigrating here. So there are costs. We've seen an uptick in measles and mumps, tuberculosis. There's risks of other diseases. And I certainly don't blame the individuals who want to come here, but it is something that policy-wise we need to have a handle on. And we have had in the past ports of entry where that sort of thing can be screened.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank our head librarian, Gianti Adelman, and everyone for coming today. I always tell people that sometimes when they're replaying on community TV, I watch these forums and they're very interesting, and it's good to have a diverse perspectives. Here you have the former chair of the Democratic Party of Monterey County and the current vice chair of the Republican Party. To your Apple or location immigration, and if you drive down the one and you look to your left or your right, all those being farmed by a coast here, Big Sur, tourist business, all of us, certainly to Monterey County, certainly, and hasn't always been a polarizing issue. We've been able to find bipartisan agreement on immigration. The last time our nation was able to agree on a major piece of immigration legislation in Washington was in 1986, the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986. It's been 32 years come this November. It was signed by President Reagan, but there was bipartisan agreement, and it was able to address a wide spectrum of immigration issues, including addressing the needs for the agricultural industry. We haven't done something like that since then. It's been a long time, decades, and our community has been waiting. When I was in the state legislature, again, we took up a call for immigration reform, and as Democrats, I said, it's not a strong message if we send a resolution to Washington and to our federal leaders by just making it a Democratic issue. I intentionally reached out to my Republican colleagues because I said we send a stronger message out of California, who so much depends on immigrant labor in our state, that if we could find a bipartisan agreement on a resolution supporting immigration. We were able to accomplish that in 2013. And in fact, for the first time ever at the Capitol in Sacramento, Republicans held their own press conference calling for immigration reform. And I was proud to be part of that effort to have a stronger message coming out of our state. That same year, I reached out to my good friend and colleague, Senator Anthony Canella, a Republican state senator. He became the first ever principal co-author of the bill that I authored, AB 60, to provide driver's license for immigrants. Now over 1 million have obtained their driver's license by being tested, licensed, and insured. So for me, when we talk about this topic, I like to remind our community that even though today it's very polarizing because of what some of our national leaders are framing and scapegoating immigrants, we have had those good examples where we're able to find agreement across party lines.
Is this on? Yeah. My answer, I mean, first of all, a lot of things were covered that I would have thought about saying. I constantly have this conversation with people about illegal immigrants paying into the Social Security system and what the empirical data is around that and how significant that amount is. Right now, I represent mostly legal immigrants now because we do employment-based immigration and legal immigrant process. And what I heard, especially when I did a lot of removal defense, was that when people were here illegally, they were trying very hard to follow the rules. And so, yeah, you can say, well, you're here illegally, so you didn't really follow the rules, but they are paying their taxes even though they know when they retire they're not going to get any of that money back. And that's pretty tragic, but they're really trying to do the right thing. One of the things that you have to prove in court is that you have, for some cases, that you have 10 years of good moral character. So I was able to hear a lot of families and people and children talking about how they perceive themselves and what that good moral character looks like, and whether it's volunteering at their church, whether it's paying into the system, whether it's helping out neighbors, and just so many different instances of good moral character. Our practice primarily focuses, like I said, on legal immigration, so I have a first-hand view every single day of people who are coming here and making incredible contributions. We deal a lot with what's called aliens of extraordinary ability and national interest waivers. And those are people who come here, usually PhDs, they're entrepreneurs, they're scientists, they're doctors, they're cancer researchers. They're doing phenomenal work, and a lot of that talent we can't, I don't want to say we don't have that in the United States, but the amount of talent that I see coming through my office is extraordinary. And so when I see, and I don't want to get into negative policy like you said, but when I see that reverse brain drain mentality where it doesn't really matter what the person's doing here, we're still going to make it very difficult so that they'll have to leave. It's really sad for the United States when we have that level of sophistication and that level of education going back to their country and starting businesses there when we could keep them here. Then as far as risks go, I really do try to be open-minded, even though I'm an immigration attorney, as far as recognizing that there are risks. I think one of the biggest risks that I see is when people are in fear, and so when they do remain in the shadows and they feel like they can't really reach their capacity as a contributing member of society, we as a society lose enormous potential. And so if you could really look at what I see a lot of the DREAM Act and DACA kids, I call them kids, they're probably not kids anymore, that they are doing, we're legitimized to a certain extent, although right now it's temporary. I just think that losing that and demonizing large is really detrimental.
Your questions, I'll just take one, the issue of legal immigration. So the three main character members and refugees, those are the sort of the primary categories for. But statistics is that almost 60% of the legal immigrants in this country are here through family preference, as opposed to either of the other two categories. So some say that this is affecting the ability of the U.S. to actually bring in high-level talent or a skilled labor force, that we're just bringing in family members. I mean, and of course there's value to that, but what do you think? Is this actually impacting the U.S.'s ability to manage immigration in a way to bring more skilled labor in? And I'm going to start with you, Kelly, for this one.
So just so I'm clear, is what?
Is the fact that there's so many people that are coming in through family preference,
family-based,
is it affecting the U.S.'s ability to actually have more immigrants who are skilled labor? Is that skewing the balance?
I don't think it's skewing the balance, because the number of visas that are available for employment-based immigrants have nothing to do with the number of visas that are available for family-based immigrants. So yeah, there's backlogged categories, particularly for India and the Philippines and China, in the employment-based categories. And then, of course, there's huge backlogs for family-based in Mexico, Philippines, India, and China. But they're completely separate as far as the number of the visas that are available. So I don't think that one is really impacting the other, in my experience.
So I just go to Vince with the same question. And Vince, do you think that there is maybe a social impact in having this kind of a balance, skewed balance?
Well, in a way, my premise coming here is that we actually don't have an immigration problem at all. We have a issue in how politically this is being managed, but the society benefits and the society could handle actually more immigration than we have. And there are many indications it needs more immigration. Partly that has to do with the fact that our actually autonomous also has to do with the things that talent seeks an outlet, and talent goes where there is. Come to California, and the reason California has the economy is because there is that fertile ground, Salinas Valley, for vegetables, but also for creative outlets, which lead to computers and so that is incredibly valuable, and that will attract people to come. And so we need that actually for economic survival, for our future. And if we start to stifle that, and we talked a little bit about this cost, it is already true now, and I hear this when I go to European countries, that people are no longer coming to the U.S. because they perceive this to be a hostile, including very talented people. I'm on this tour, I'm going everywhere but West, because this is not a welcoming place. And so that's a cost that's hard for us to quantify because we really don't experience it directly. Not to mention the other side, the human toll of the kind of family separation issues. That's kind of a different category. But I do think, again, I think we don't actually have an immigration problem. In fact, again, immigration's been on decline. We do need to address the management of immigration in a way that also allows people to come out of the shadows, which is better for everyone concerned. So I think that's sort of a premise, is kind of looking at this a little differently.
So, and actually, so if we don't have an immigration problem, but there is a very strong anti-immigrant sentiment that's rising, and this is happening throughout the world. It's not just in the US, it's happening in Europe, in Australia, in Russia, and even in Asia. There's a big, countries that have to receive immigrants are really developing this strong anti-immigrant sentiment. So why now? Why is this happening now? And I'm actually going to go to Jeff for that. Do you have an opinion on this?
For why there's a massive nativist impetus going around the globe right now? Is that what you're asking?
Anti-immigrant or nativist, you get whichever way.
I think I'd like to just fall back a little bit to the question of legal immigration, the quantities. I'm not an expert about that. I'm really looking at the big picture of what's going on. Why do people feel so much animosity, fear, anxiety, whatever it is? What is going on? So it sort of approaches your point, but I think if you look at wages over the last 20 or 30 years, they really haven't improved very much, especially for lower skilled jobs, people without college education, without a technical training. Their wages have not improved, and it actually, with the automated systems and more built-in intelligence and devices, there's a risk that that trend keeps getting worse for a while. And so the question of who gets to immigrate, I think, is very critical that we address it. I don't know that I have the answer. I do know there are charts out there that are cyclical in how many foreign-born people are in the United States as a percentage of the whole, and we are near a very high level. So just to keep it tight, I'll say, I think when Vince says we can handle more immigration, I think that the stress indicates better not push our luck. You know, there was an anarchy movement 120 years ago, took President McKinley, blew up the New York Stock Exchange, and kind of led to the creation of the FBI and a lot of other things. So we might want to be just attentive to those that sort of drumbeat of the natives that is going on worldwide. It's real. And I'd ask to add to the list of places that are struggling. Colombia has over 1 million Venezuelan refugees who are fleeing a failed socialist state. And that's looking like it's going to get worse. And Nicaragua, which is Central America, is struggling. And a lot of the people showing up at our border now, the Mexican numbers are down, maybe along the lines of what Vince is saying, I don't know. But the Central American numbers are way up. So there's a lot of meat on that bone.
Supervisor.
Thank you.
So,
There it is. First of all, I wanted to address the issues regarding skilled labor and challenge the concept of unskilled labor. First of all, skilled labor, I had the opportunity to attend the Silicon Valley Leadership Group that had dozens of CEOs of big tech companies, biotech, for San Francisco 49ers. They had a lot of people at the table. And repeatedly, that industry is heavily dependent on immigrant visas. I had an opportunity to attend UC San Francisco, and some of the most successful U.S. companies were started by immigrants. And so I think it's against our interests when talented people come to get a great education here in our universities, whether it's California or throughout the rest of our nation, and if we have a no welcome sign to them and they go back to their home countries, they become the competitors against U.S. companies. So we kind of undermine our own interest. Genentech is, it's the largest biotech company in the world, generating thousands of jobs for the American economy, a true immigrant success story. On the other concept of unskilled labor, anyone who's ever done agricultural work could attest. Ask any farmer in the Salinas Valley, they would assure you that that kind of work is very skilled labor. I challenge anybody to try that just for one day or for a few hours, and you will realize how hard and skilled that really is. So all this talk about merit and basing future immigration solely on merit undermines us as well. And our own family stories could attest to that. Here I am with my staff in the back. All our families came as immigrants from Mexico. And my grandparents came in the 1950s during the Baracero program, which was a guest worker program at that time. My grandfather only went to the 3rd grade. My grandmother never had a chance to go to school at all. She started working at the age of 12. But the next generation, she made sure all her kids graduated from high school. 4 or 5 sons served our nation in the United States Army, as honorably discharged. And her grandkids now have graduated from places like Harvard, UC Davis School of Law, Berkeley, NYU, some of the most prestigious universities in the world. It shows you that if you let immigrants who are entrepreneurs, who have this spirit of hard work and making an honest living, contributing to this nation, that they could also accomplish some really great things, just like the immigrants who started companies like Genentech. So I just wanted to frame it that way, that on both sides, I think it's a success to our country. But the question about anti-immigrant sentiment, it's nothing new. We've been here before. And that's the story throughout the history of mankind. Mankind have always immigrated, have always tried to find a better life somewhere, crossing borders, crossing rivers, whatever it may be, to find a better life. That's the story of humans. But it's also the story here in the United States. And different populations have been targets. They've been scapegoats. Today it might be Muslim or Latino immigrants, but one time it was Italian immigrants and Irish immigrants, German immigrants. And they faced the same kind of repression by different groups here throughout U.S. history. And there's been waves, any political scientist will tell you that, and you study our laws and cases that came out of our courts, there's waves of anti-immigrant sentiment that's reflected in our laws and our statutes and in our court decisions. So it's nothing new. The only last example I want to say, the last time we really saw this in California was back in the mid-90s. It was, and politicians using immigration as a wedge issue is nothing new. It's always happened. But in 1994, I was 19 at the time, we had Governor Pete Wilson running for election. Mm-hmm. And there was a recession in the mid-90s. He scapegoated immigrants, attacked them. He won his re-election based on that. But it had long-term consequences for California. 20 years later, I think it really hurt the Republican Party. They lost the majority of the Assembly and the Senate, giving Democrats now almost 2/3 in each house today. They lost every constitutional statewide office in our state, including the governorship. And the demographics are changing in California. And that's why I think we have a different sentiment, because many of our families now, I'm a Latino, but I got African-American relatives, Croatian and Filipino. We've all become family at some point, and that's the story, I think, of California. But I think what we're seeing happen at the national level, I think we're going to see what happened in California also happen 20 years from now at a national level.
And it's interesting, you raised the issue of this, immigrants and everyone, actually, when you talk about it, they acknowledge, this is a country of immigrants, and that immigrants have made significant contributions. You talk about Genentech, and there's just different examples. So, but there's also the issue of scapegoating, and is it, there are larger problems, like whether it's guns or, violence or drug trafficking, whatever it is, and then we are trying to find sort of distracting in a way from that issue. But it also is, there's some concern that, is this just a latent racism rising to the surface? Because, you'll see like people who are harassing men in, say, turbans, or will attack a woman speaking in Spanish, on the road, will think nothing of a man walking along in a kilt, or will never dream of protesting the St. Patrick's Day parade.
I'll take that on, if you don't mind.
Yes.
I think, first of all, I acknowledge scapegoating is a factor in politics. And I appreciate the legislative process and your experience with that, because we have a system of laws here, and we need to stick to that, because otherwise it can become very personality-driven and mob-driven, and it becomes dangerous. And I wanted to speak up at this time for two reasons. One is to hit on Rwanda and what happened there. It's black-on-black violence in a hundreds of thousands of people away. Totally ugly. I don't know that much about it, but I can tell you it quakes my heart to think about it. And then my grandfather, who emigrated from the United States in 1916 to China and made his home there. My dad and my aunts and uncles were born there in China. And during World War II, my grandfather was interned by the Japanese in China. And when he returned to China, he got out in an exchange, came to the United States, went back to China from 45 to 48, and was thrown out by a very strong nativist sentiment of Maoists. So you're right, it's not new. You're right, it's a story of humanity. And I think sometimes scapegoating, I don't want to be the first one to bring up a name, but I will say the immigration problems predated our current president.
Sure.
Certainly.
That's okay, yeah. Yeah, and you know, I will say I had both your names on this question, so.
Well, first, I do want to emphasize, I don't speak for the Democratic Party. I was the chair. I'm a private citizen with opinions and with some history, but I don't speak for the party. I do want to say one thing, and I want to challenge the notion that we actually live in a nativist sort of era. It turns out, I looked up the research on this, and Pew Center on Population Studies and Immigration has some very interesting data, which surprised me, including, for example, I think both, it turns out, and this is maybe not as big a surprise, that Americans are actually misinformed about immigration in a significant way. For example, more than half of us think that the majority of immigrants are here illegally, when it's less than a quarter. So that's an interesting, erroneous assumption. But what's also interesting is that the general population is ahead of electeds in many ways in terms of their perception and their tolerance of immigrants. So, for example, this was an interesting piece of information. Since 2001, the share of Americans who support a decrease, who want immigration to decrease, has declined from more than 50% in 2001 to now less than 30%, right? So we have a decline in people who think that immigration should actually decrease, and the corresponding actually increase in people who think that immigration is fine or could even increase, and that would be fine. People are not bothered by the fact that other languages are being spoken, the way that this is being portrayed. So I would challenge the notion that we actually have a strong nativist sentiment. The fact that it's being exploited politically is a different story. And that is the risk that I think we're facing. And I think Jeff brought up an interesting point. I do actually think the fear that people experience in communities that have been neglected, and I've worked in some of them. I mean, I've been through rural Pennsylvania, and I've seen these towns, some of them company towns, in decline. And they are looking for an explanation for the decline that they experience. And this is real. Their wages, either if they still have a job, their wages have been in decline. And so the question is, what is their explanation for why they are currently not well off or are feeling like they're in decline? And there, obviously, if you make a strong case, that's because these people have taken your job, then, you have fertile ground sometimes. But that doesn't mean that it is either correct nor that actually the population in and of itself has this sentiment. Because we're at a library, I looked up the word xenophobia. I figured I better have my definition right, and it is the fear of foreigners, or of strangers. There's a little bit of a debate in the Greek. And I think that is, in a way, we could say a natural impulse. But I think this country is one of the best examples of a society that has overcome that fear. Again, we're not in a perfect union. We're trying to become more perfect in that way. But we are actually trying to find ways to not be driven by fear of the other, of the stranger. And I do think every society runs the risk of falling into the fear of strangers. It's very easy to actually foment fear. But I do think the numbers don't suggest that Americans as a whole are actually in a sort of a nativist trend at all.
Well, and sort of related to that, it isn't necessarily just, it could be small pockets. But one of the challenges, and this is actually very common in most of the states that are the, what should I say, the coastal states and the states that have been seeing a lot of immigration, is this rapid cultural shifts. So they can, uncontrolled immigration obviously can have a negative impact on economies. That is a different thing. But this, where you have, it goes back right to the problem of when the white settlers originally came to the New World, then there was in the 19th century, and it just keeps resurfacing when immigration happens rapidly or in one group comes, rather than a variety or a diverse group. So, for example, someone who grew up being able to speak English in the neighborhood stores may find themselves increasingly isolated because of the languages that are being spoken around them, and they've never moved. This is where they grew up. And suddenly they can no longer understand what people are saying in their neighborhood stores. Or you have an immigrant who has lived in this country for 30 years, and I'm not picking on anyone, I'm just giving these as examples, that, who, for example, a man who will not let his wife or daughter go to work, who's going to insist that they can't go to school, can't talk to men, or something like that, So in this sort of a context, like, how do we respond to these shifting balances or threats to economic and cultural stability? And how important is cultural or social integration or the need to conform to local norms? So I'm going to go to you, Kelly.
Well, there's so much that's been said that I want to respond to.
I will say keep it brief so we can...
I will keep it brief. I was just thinking about the Rwanda comparison, and I have some issues with that as far as using that as an argument for what it is we're discussing. It's so difficult for me to not go back to Nazi Germany when we're talking about these sort of things. And I don't mean to be, not in a hyperbolic way. I'm Jewish, so anytime you start talking about, it's hard for me not to relate it back to anti-Semitism, and it's hard for me not to look at what the economic conditions were in Germany at that time, and that somebody needed to be scapegoated. Okay, the Jews were scapegoated back to 1500s for different reasons, but to me, there's so many parallels happening right now, and it's difficult for me to answer these questions and to look at these issues without talking about the current administration. And yes, a lot of these things predate the current administration. I get it, and we've always had these issues, and we've had scapegoating and things like that. But right now, what I'm seeing is this. It's a different kind of feeling. I don't know if any of you use that neighborhood website, where you can talk to your neighbor. Nextdoor, yeah. So I've been noticing, I read it almost in this sociological experiment kind of way. I've been noticing lately that people seem to be getting meaner and meaner to each other. And these are people that are neighbors and people that you might see in the supermarket. And somebody will say, my bike got stolen. And somebody will say, well, that's what you get for being a sanctuary state. And that's a real example that happened.
My neighborhood is so much nicer.
Yours must be. Yeah, I'm in seedy Aptos, but...
But if I could just address the Rwanda thing. Again, I haven't been there. I was a student of foreign policy immediately before that, and I was trading emerging markets debt at the time that occurred. But the reason I brought it up was to point out that it's not racism in the sense of like black and white. It's more, I would call it more tribalism. And again, I'm sympathetic, very concerned about the Nazi phenomenon. It's worthy of study. But generally speaking, the Jews appeared the same. There was a lot of made up anatomical differentiation, but the reality is it wasn't a particularly racial thing in my mind of what racism is. It was scapegoating, to be sure. But so I actually brought up Rwanda. They had ways of telling each other apart, but they were, from an American point of view, they're black Africans, right?
Yeah, I understand. So I think, that's really addressing the last question, not the last question you just asked me, but the question before that, because I was just thinking a lot about why are people being mean to each other, and in our office, we made a decision that we weren't going to blame the administration on everything that goes wrong. And sometimes we make a mistake and we can't say, oh, it's Trump's fault. We have to say, well, I marked the wrong box and it's our fault. But I'm just really seeing something new in having, I've practiced immigration law going on 26 years, and it's something new. And I feel like if the leadership isn't putting the, I don't know if the word kibosh is a racist word even, putting the kibosh on some of those things that are happening, if there's nobody up there saying to their base, that's not okay, that is not how we treat each other, I think it gives people permission to express things that they might have felt but maybe shouldn't express. I mean, there is racism. We all have racism in us. There's always a time where we feel afraid, and it might not be logical, and it might be because of the color of someone's skin. I'm not going to pretend that I'm immune to that, but it almost seems like there's been given some sort of permission to be racist. And that's really troubling to me. And it's something that I haven't seen before. And I'm just thinking about it a lot. I'm thinking about neighbor to neighbor. What's happening? Why are we being mean to each other?
That's a good point. And I will say that's one of the reasons we have these conversations, where we really want to talk about what's going on, why is it happening, and really trying to see the other person's side, because there's always a rational explanation. And in fact, and I know I myself said we're not going to talk about politicians, but the issue of Trump, I mean, it becomes both ways. Like, people do talk about whether there was this whole group that had been afraid to express themselves for so long, and now suddenly got a chance to elect someone who would speak for them, so to speak. And again, I'm not saying this is my opinion or it's the right opinion.
Sure.
I'm just saying that's what it's.
Well, we have to tiptoe around it, I believe. And I also think that we live in a very culturally diverse area, and we're really lucky that we do. And our food is diverse, and the people are diverse. And I mean, my office, we have Chandani from India, we have someone who's from Bosnia, we have somebody who's of Mexican descent. It's just everywhere, and so we're so used to it. We're not used to living in a small town that might be predominantly white, and that also might be suffering from a lot of economic distress. And so you do need somewhere to go with that anger and that fear.
Did you want to address that?
No, I do think, though, it's unfortunate that we do see our national leaders fanning the racial flames. When I turn on the news, it's hard to hear some of the things that are being said by our national leaders, that whether they're stereotypes, whether they're derogatory to a certain population. I think it exacerbates those underlying feelings that some segment of our society are feeling. But I think here in California, I think we have a different story. Although we're not perfect in California either, we have come a long way. When you look at public opinion on a wide range of issues relating to immigration, it's dramatically changed in the last 20 years, 25 years. Here we are living in the most diverse state, more diverse than the state of New York. We're a majority state now. Latinos are 40% of the population. 76% of the children in California public schools, K through 12, are children of color. So that's the future of California, very diverse. So I think when we live in this diverse society, I think we all live a kind of a shared experience, and our views on certain issues dramatically change. But I hope, as a younger elected official, I would hope our national leaders would, instead of focusing on what we have as differences, I wish we would learn more in our schools and hear more about what we have in common. And when I study the history of agriculture in Monterey County, and today when we all see the Latinos, and there's even new waves of Latinos from the state of Oaxaca and indigenous groups in places like Greenfield. But the people used to do the same hard work were the Italians in Castroville, the Swiss immigrants in central Monterey County, the migrants who came from and who were mistreated when they came to California from Oklahoma and Arkansas, and they settled in places like the Alisal. You hear those histories and said, that's my history. Those ancestors came with the same dreams and aspirations, just like my grandparents did. And when you study that history, you realize, and I love local history, but when you study it, you realize how much we have in common. And I think we need to remind ourselves and tell our powerful stories of our own families. If we go back just a generation or two, we'll find out how much we have in common, and we have failed to do that in a way. And that's why I think it's imperative that we incorporate some of these histories into our schools, so that in a diverse state like California, I could be learning about the diverse histories of Filipinos and Japanese immigrants and Chinese and the native peoples of the Monterey Bay Area, which often we don't have. I just want to end with this. When I studied my own family history, when my grandparents first came to Watsonville to work in strawberries, the first family to give my grandfather a job was a Japanese-American farmer, Roy Takamune. Gave my family a place to live, gave him a job. 3 years later, they were both sharecroppers selling strawberries to Driscoll's. Two families from two different parts of the world, but helping each other out. And to me, when you learn about those kind of examples, it's good to share that with the community. Ask them, look at your own family history, because you'll find out in the end we have much more in common than we have as differences.
I can see you championing at the bit. So
I know your question was about assimilation, but I do think actually one interesting example, this is why California is such a powerful example, and Manuel Pastor out of UC Berkeley has a book out called The State of Resistance, about the state of California, and he basically argues that California is the future of the United States, and that it actually is an example of, and demonstrates that the kind of, it's not really a melting pot, it's like a Greek salad with lots of pieces that don't become the same just because they live together, but they do get along and they help each other out and they enhance the flavor of the whole thing. This is what is actually making California so successful. And one of the reasons we are so capable as exporters of material goods and dreams coming out of the dream factories of Southern California is the diversity is the strength. And again, this is imperfect, but I think it's a sign that both assimilation is, in terms of the idea of civility, is important, actually. And I'm glad to know that this is a civil discourse and this civility matters. I think it's very important that that's possible. And assimilation in terms of all looking the same or walking the same way or even talking the same language is not as important. And I think, again, California is a success story that can teach the rest of the country something. And it also is a counterpoint, and I think Luis is right in terms of the history. California went through that experience, and we are here now because we went a certain direction after that really dark experience in the early 90s. So I think that this is a hopeful note to me about the fact that we're sort of looking into the future when we look at California.
Yeah, so since you brought up the issue of civility, and Jeff's essay in the Herald was about this sort of maintaining calm and being civil about these different issues, and specifically about this when discussing the issue of citizenship in the census program. So I think that's sort of, an interesting thing, because really it is an interesting data. It is interesting data to know whether people are immigrants or citizens, or citizens or non-citizens, I should say. But there is the issue of deterrence, that, are people afraid? So actually, I'll start with Jeff asking, what do you think? Is there good? Is there bad? What would be the, impact? And then I'll come to you, Kelly, after that. Yeah.
I got so caught up thinking about my essay, I kind of missed, is there good or bad what?
No, just the issue of requiring people to state whether they are citizens or not in the census.
So I'll just say briefly, my essay is about problem solving from a very abstract point of view. You want to get the data, the given, if you're thinking about back to mathematics days, and then apply your formulas and your skills to get the right answer. And in mathematics, there's a true answer. In all but very rare cases, there's a right answer in mathematics. And so for a problem solver, that's how you would approach it. You'd want to get the information and take it on. What kids are having trouble in school? What do they need? Address it. And so what I see happening is fear on both sides. There's America is exceptional point of view. I think it's healthy in moderate doses for our psyche and our happiness as Americans to think that this is a great place. And there are people that feel threatened by it, rightly or wrongly. And then on the same token, there's people that have made their way here in the United States. Some of them have gone through tremendous hurdles to get legal citizenship. Others have, for one reason or another, come here to seek a better life, and they have found it, but they are afraid. And so I think civility is necessary to get away from the polarizing fear and anxiety and toward healthy middle ground. And so I've asked, what is causing all this fear? And I can understand why someone that is, there's many reasons why someone might fear the repercussions of a tighter immigration system. But in particular, I've witnessed only one egregious hit and run accident where the person got clean away. And I have to confess to you, my brothers and sisters, that I thought that person probably knew they would run immigration problems. They probably didn't have a driver's license. Probably didn't. Thank you, Louis, for your efforts. But this was after your law. They probably didn't have insurance. They probably had no way of paying for the damages. And they drove away. And so it's like little things like that. Those little fears are very detrimental to our society.
And then on the other hand, it could be someone who had just been drinking and driving and did not want
Could
to
have
get
been.
caught, so that is that is definitely an issue. I just want to say, my son is a mathematician, and he'd say, yes, mathematics has a right or wrong answer, but statisticians, there's no trusting them. So, yeah. But Kelly, would you like to address the issue of the census and requiring immigration status?
I did read the essay, thank you. I thought it was really well written, balanced, and I'm curious what you think about it, because I think it's a tender subject, whether or not somebody should be required to say if they're a citizen or not. I'm not quite sure statistically what information is really gained from that number. Because I think a lot of the census, there's specific purposes for asking all the different questions, and there's a reason for them. I'm not quite sure what the reason is for asking someone if they're a citizen. I completely understand the fear that might surround that question. I don't know. I don't really know the answer. Yeah, I would like to hear what Louis has to say.
This is a hot topic, and it's really on point today. First of all, I wrote an op-ed in the San Jose Mercury News on this in January. We were one of the first counties to come out expressing concern about the census, and everyone loses when we put a citizenship on the 2020 census, which only happens, as we know, every 10 years. Everyone loses. Everyone in Monterey County will lose if we include it. Everyone in California will lose because we're dependent on that census to give an accurate count, make sure everybody's counted, because federal dollars, billions of federal dollars, come to California and come to Monterey County, millions come to Monterey County, based on that census. If we add the citizenship question, which the United States has not done since 1950, it will deter significant numbers of immigrants from participating, giving their information. And I'm not saying this, but research experts, even the U.S. Bureau of Census staff and advisory board recommended against it. So Monterey County is one of only 4 counties in the country that have joined a lawsuit. The 2 biggest ones have been filed in New York, along with 18 states, several cities, and the U.S. Conference of Mayors. Today there was a decision to consolidate the 2 New York cases, and as a result of this lawsuit, there's been a Freedom of Information Act request, and those emails, it's been all national news yesterday, showed that U.S. Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross orchestrated and fabricated a false reason to include the citizenship. They were the ones who were pushing the Department of Justice to include it. So in December, the U.S. Department of Justice sent a letter requesting it, but the emails revealed that months ahead, they were adding the pressure to do that. So today, the judge's decision, the hearing is going to be set for October, but the judge concluded that it's likely that this citizen question was motivated by discriminatory animus, and that it's likely to have a discriminatory effect. Those are our federal courts looking at some of the evidence preliminarily and making those early conclusions. So I hope that in the end, our federal courts will intervene and ensure that this question will not include it, so we could make sure that we have an accurate count. On the state level, the governor has made this a top priority. Originally, in the January proposed budget, the governor wanted to include over $40 million to prepare California to have an accurate count. In June, when they approved the budget, it became 90 because they knew they were going to have to do a lot more work to ensure an accurate count now that the citizenship question was added. So California has a lot on the line, and it's in our interest to make sure that that question is removed.
Okay, I'm sold.
Just,
I was just saying, I'm sold. I just needed to hear
Okay.
the arguments on both sides.
well, when it comes to social
And I would say
scientists,
let's be quick because
right,
I
I'll be
want to
super quick.
get
On the
to
social
question.
science side, the reason this is so challenging to add a question, I mean, these questions, it sounds simple to ask questions on the census, but they go through an enormous amount of testing in order to ensure that the results are valid. And this is not like math, it is like social science, and it's a little messy. And so there is very good reason why the scientists in this instance at the Census Bureau said, we cannot add this without having enormous impact on the validity of the whole survey. And so this is not the way to go about it, changing the survey at this point.
Okay, so I'm going to go completely change our topic here. And today being Thursday, July 26th, this is the day that the Trump administration had been tasked with reuniting the 2,551 children between the ages of 5 and 17 who had been separated from their parents. And today was the deadline. And it was acknowledged that they wouldn't be able to get to that. They wouldn't be able to complete it. And there's various reasons, some of which where the parents can't be traced, some, I mean, just there's a whole variety of reasons. And so this goes back to the April 2018 zero tolerance policy in terms of crossing on most of the southwest borders. And Jeff Sessions said that it's that simple. If you smuggle illegal aliens across our border, then we will prosecute you. If you are smuggling a child, then we will prosecute you, and that child will be separated from you as required by law. And actually, separation had been happening all of last year also. It hasn't just started since April. So my question is, I mean, this is something that's really, really upset our nation. And I think it's across, you know, it's not partisan. People have been really bothered by it. Have we reached a low point in US political history? I mean, what would the long-term impacts of actions like this be, both not only on the children and the families, but also on the US's standing in the world? And, you know, and Vince touched on this a little bit, on people even from Europe not wanting to come here. And what are the next steps the government should take? Well, this is going to be, well, if each one of you, I'd really like to ask each one of you, and if you could keep your answers brief, that would be really good. Yeah.
I'll keep it really brief. It was very interesting to me to see this as a tipping point when there was, you know, just watching what was going on in our country and then seeing this bipartisan reaction to this. I think, I know everyone has something to say. I've been thinking a lot about the impact on children when they're separated from their parents and how we can watch it on TV and we can hear about it and read about it, but you can't really feel it unless you can really feel it. And there have been a lot of studies about children being separated from their parents. You know, if you look at the children in the Romanian orphanages, and if you look at kids who were put on trains in England during World War II and they were sent to, you know, to safety, and it turned out that they would rather be with their parents with bombs falling all around them than be separated from their parents. I think that the long-term impact is going to be huge, and I don't think we'll ever even really know it because, you know, we're not going to follow along with each family and see what kind of issues develop for these children. But I think it was so short-sighted. I think it was, let's go to the border and make an announcement and everyone will say raw, and I don't think they had any idea what was coming.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think the administration themselves were taken by surprise. Luis?
Well, I think when we look back at the history books on the year of 2018, we're going to see that this is one of the saddest chapters in American history. Mm-hmm. It's unconscionable, it's un-American. Any of us that have children, grandchildren, nieces or nephews, we know how hard it is to separate a child from their parents. We know how hard it is just sending a child to the first day of kindergarten and leaving them at school, how hard that one day alone is much less separating them for days on end, and not knowing what's coming next in your young life. And here we have a president who threatened fire and fury to North Korea. On a tweet yesterday, he threatened Iran with suffering that the world has never seen before. But yet, the most powerful nation on earth cannot reunite 2,500 children with their parents, even though they're all within the custody and detention of 3 federal agencies. It just blows me away that with our technology, with our tech companies, and that they're in our government's control, we can reunite them much quicker. But the true answer to how do you deal with that is, what is our nation doing to help the countries where these families are coming from? In 2014, we saw a spike of refugee children coming from Central America. So it's 4 years ago. This month, I was visiting Port Hueneme because it was one of the few detention centers by the Department of Health and Human Services that was trying to relocate these unaccompanied minors with their family members or friends in the United States. So then after that, I led the delegation with Senator Steinberg, the president of the California Senate. It was the first delegation to Central America. We went to Guatemala and El Salvador to find out what are the reasons why these children are coming. When you study the history of those countries, a lot has to do with U.S. intervention, supporting oppressive regimes, and that resulted in civil wars. In El Salvador, for example, their civil war ended in the early 1990s. We're only 25 years later, recovering from one of the worst atrocities and violence in that country then, and they're still trying to come out of that. When you went to Guatemala, I met with congressional leaders that are not even investing in their public education system. So if I'm a Mayan young person in a rural part in the western highlands of Guatemala, and I have no hope, no opportunity, there's no investment in public education, guess what I'm going to do? I'm going to find a better life somewhere else and take that risk coming away. So I think if we really want to address that problem, it's supporting U.S. policies that help lift the economic prosperity in those countries if we want to end the wave. What we're seeing now in Mexico is exactly that. There's an upturn in the Mexican economy. That's why we see a significant drop in waves of Mexican migration, because now a lot of U.S. companies are investing, even Salinas Valley companies are investing in the states of Jalisco, and Guanajuato, and Michoacan. So people are finding a reason not to migrate because they'd rather stay at home and have a good life in their home countries.
Thank you. That's a good point, because one of the challenges is that, we have people, whether it's the temporary protected status or they're using that, people are still coming from the Northern Triangle countries, but we are sending people back while more people are trying to come. So that is an issue. But I'd like to give both Jeff and Vince.
Do you mind going ahead, Vince?
Not at all. I think, clearly this is unconscionable by a government to put children through that, and it's a violation of human rights, and it serves no good objective. I think, does it harm us? Yes, in more ways than just with the kids and the families themselves. It also harms us in being able to then say something about other countries that violate human rights. There is this equivocation that happens. So I think I agree with Luis that we are capable of doing this right, and we are capable of reuniting individuals with each other if we have the will to do so. This was not one of those cases. It is a dark chapter. I hope we come out of it very quickly. There are other ways in which the objective of, the purported objective of keeping borders safe can be achieved without, damaging children for the rest of their lives.
Yeah, and I do want to say also the 2,551 number was children 5 to 7.
Right.
There were another 900 or so under the age of 5. So it was actually quite a large number of separated children. Yeah. But Jeff, you.
Dara? It always comes on so loud once it comes on. It is a very sensitive topic. I think it's the only topic I've seen President Trump really reverse his administration on so firmly, and I'm glad that he did. I do know a little bit about childhood trauma, and I agree that it takes a long time to repair damage to a human life, and sometimes you can't. I do know a little bit about the penal system, the prisons, the jails, and family separation at the time of someone going away to prison or jail, and it's also brutal, and that one of the debates we used to have in this country is, are people that are undocumented immigrants legal or illegal? And it turns out it is a crime to overstay your visa, and it is a crime to enter the country outside of a port of call. So the zero tolerance policy, I'm loath to defend it, partly because I have to live in this county, right? But the reality is that we need to enforce our laws. And if the laws need to be changed, our lawmakers need to change them. But, so I'm sympathetic to an administrator that is given orders and tries to push through those orders. And I'm grateful that Mr. Trump backed off of that, because it was not going in a positive direction for our country, that's clear. I think there was a lot of hysteria, including there was a protest scheduled right before Mr. Trump, like it boiled up on the 18th, on the 20th, there was a protest scheduled on the 22nd. It happened, but Mr. Trump had already reversed himself. And the notice I received of it was a picture of a little girl crying, which is quite famous. It was on the Time magazine. It turns out that child was not separated from her mother. She was put down on the ground for 10 seconds while her mother was being frisked and taken into custody. And so the hype and scapegoating and mob mentality that came out in this country is terrifying. It terrifies me along the lines of being Jewish in Germany. It terrifies it. I will say this about being a Republican in Monterey County. I know I have talked to dozens and dozens of people that are either registered Republicans but afraid to admit it, or decline to state because they're real estate agents or whatever. They're afraid to be Republican, and this predates Trump. There is intimidation in this county against Republicans, and I can see my friend nodding his head. It's very real, and so I'm using this as an opportunity to demonstrate that mob mentality and that fear goes both ways.
Right, and this is true, and that's exactly what, we can talk of racism, or we can talk of tribalism, but it doesn't matter what it is. We do tend to have this, if you're in a minority, the chances are you're feeling threatened at some point. It doesn't matter what kind of minority you are. And some minorities are based on choice, and some are not based on choice. So, it just varies. But I'm actually going to just ask, do you think that these changes, and we've seen a lot of changes in the way immigration laws are being enforced, because we've had some of these are just a question of enforcing laws, which in the past was, let's, be more, I just want to say more kinder about how they're being enforced, whereas being, this is the law, let's enforce it. So do you think that these changes are being made, on the immigration front are essential for the U.S. economy or other situations in the U.S., or do you think these changes are simply political and perhaps pandering to a small part of the population? And so I'm actually going to start with you, Kelly, for that question.
All right. It's a tough one.
And I'm going to say let's keep it brief.
Okay, but really brief. And I think because there's 4 of us, I'm just going to focus on employment-based immigration, because to me it's so fascinating how difficult it is to immigrate through employment, and how long it takes, and the process that you have to go through, and the Department of Labor and the USCIS, and I don't see how that can benefit the economy. And when people say to me, the immigrants are taking our jobs, you're an employment immigration lawyer, how do you feel about that? I always say, why would an employer go through the hell that they have to go through to hire one software engineer on an H-1B visa, pay an attorney, pay the filing fees, go through the lottery system, sometimes have a request for evidence from immigration, have the case approved, denied, whatever. Why would you do that if you could find a qualified, talented individual? You have to pay them the prevailing wage. You have to get certified through the Department of Labor. There's so many different steps you have to go through that I never understand that argument of this person's taking my job.
Go ahead.
I'm not ready.
Go ahead.
Go for it, Lutz, or do Vince, do you want to? I'm going to just.
Well, I'm happy to jump in. I think, are they helpful or harmful? I think was the question, right?
The question was, is there a reason? Are we just pandering, or is there a genuine, like if there is like Jeff mentioned that, they're enforcing laws or whatever. What do you think?
Well, I think it is pandering. I think there are legitimate issues all along the problem I see, and I think Jeff is right, we should solve the real problem behind that causes these situations from occurring. Now, of course, we have an administration and we have a Congress and we have the same party in control of both, and so they could actually do this. There are reasons that's not happening, because I think, in essence, having immigrants as punching bags is actually serving a purpose, a political purpose, hate to say it. And so I think the cost, again, the data shows the population is actually further along. They are not worried. They're not as worried about the economic impact or the negative impact. They see a positive impact. So I think it's another one of those political issues that the population's ahead, the problem could be solved, but right now there's benefits to be gained politically from not solving it. And so I do think we are harmed economically. There's a famous case in a county in, I think it's Kentucky, where ICE came in, all the immigrants disappeared from schools and everywhere, and the people who were quite in favor of the crackdown were shocked by the effect of the crackdown and changed their mind and said, oh my God, I didn't know that, all these people were undocumented, and I didn't know that this would have that effect. I didn't want those kids to disappear from the school, and now the school has to close because we don't have enough kids. So I think we are all harmed by that. And I do think they're legitimate issues that we do need to deal with. And I'm actually with Jeff on the idea that if we can ramp down the rhetoric and the heat, we could actually get to solving those problems the way Congress used to, but hasn't lately. But that really does require a lot of reducing of the rhetoric and the heat.
Okay, so I'm going to give our next two speakers 2 minutes each so we can keep going. Yeah.
Okay, what I'll say is immigration at the border is at a record low. And in fact, the numbers of border agents is at a record high, and they have implemented the latest technology that we have on the border, whether it's drones, heat sensors, all that technology is there. So in the areas that used to be the crossing points, now it has driven immigrants to cross in the most treacherous desert areas, really putting their lives at risk. But what does it mean for Monterey County? The lack of labor has now resulted in a major crisis in every agricultural area, but certainly here in Monterey County, where farmers are having a hard time keeping labor. You have a new industry like cannabis coming in. They're pulling workers into that industry. And farmers are now having to pay more for the cost of labor, because if somebody's paying $1 more here and this guy's not, guess where the workers are going to go? They're going to go to where the wages are more. Now you have companies like Tana Maranto that are offering additional incentives, such as housing. The Origo Farm just signed a contract that extended healthcare to try to keep their employees there working. And what I've noticed in the last 3 years is a record number of companies having to resort to H-2A workers, guest workers in agriculture, which requires them to also provide housing, which now we have a new workforce, thousands of workers coming in. There's a limited housing supply. It's also impacting housing and rent costs in our area. Last thing I wanted to talk about was ag tech, because there's a lot of talk about ag tech. But because of the labor shortage, when the majority of ag tech discussions are all around mechanization of agriculture because of the lack of workers to do those jobs. So it's having a tremendous impact in many different ways here in our county.
Thank you. And Jeff?
Thank you. So actually, I'm not a student of immigration to such an extent that I can tell what changes have been made. I think the increase of enforcement is one clear change, and I actually would agree with Vince on the mechanics of it, is that there is an attempt to make it a bigger issue so that it gets in the public eye and gets consideration, this enforcement of immigration law. And maybe it will result in an overcoming of the filibuster, which has been the Republicans' problems. And it would be interesting if the Republicans had 60 votes in the Senate, if they would actually do anything about it. I have my own doubts and questions, but with the filibuster, it's not possible. And Mr. Schumer is Mr. Leon Panetta's former roommate. So we have local politicians here that could put some heat on if we wanted to get over the filibuster. Now, as far as whether it's for effect, Mr. Alejo just demonstrated the power of politicians, and he's very knowledgeable, but he just manipulated the mic, I'm sure well over 2 minutes. So I hope that we will go a little longer so that we can discuss one of Mr. Alejo's best questions is what can we do to help our neighbors? And this country has a long and sometimes proud and sometimes troubled history of intervention in foreign countries. So that maybe we will have a minute or two to talk about it.
Yeah, so actually you just asked my question, which was, in 2015, the UN reported that there was a worldwide total migration of 244 million people. Of these, 54 million settled in North America, which is basically US and Canada. And so that's almost 1/5 of the total migration is happening towards North America. But most people don't want to leave their countries if, and immigrate, if they could find decent jobs at home, if they could have safety, all these different issues. And many countries, and I think Kelly talked about this, that many countries are also suffering from brain drain because of this move to a more prosperous countries. So, it works both ways, whether the US loses people or whether we take people from other countries. So, what can we do to help countries retain their own populations and give populations a chance to thrive where they are? And really quickly, one sentence each, if I can, from each of you. Yeah.
I'll make it really quick. It's my book there. Again, from the employment-based point of view, because that's what I know the most about, I really like the J1 training programs where you bring people here and you can train them and then they have to go back to their country for at least 2 years before they can, if they want to immigrate, they can. But generally, unless they can get a waiver, they are required to go back. So I was just talking to 2 businessmen from El Salvador today and they want to start a business in Seattle. And all they want to do is bring people here, train them, do some tech training, bring them back to work for their country in El Salvador. So I think it's a really good program if it's utilized properly.
Okay. Who would like to go next? Quick answer.
Yeah, quick answer. I do think clearly the idea of being able to help countries all around the world in a global way develop is key. And I do think the US, again, is an amazing engine of talent, of people who come here, go to as education at our fantastic universities, and then go back and help their countries. And there's an exchange. Even the folks who stay here help their countries by helping develop these partnerships. I do think, and I sometimes disagree with my friends, my Democratic friends, that actually we are in a global economy. I do think trade is important and significant and is actually a force for good. Not all of it has to be managed as well, but it is a force for good in this way. And I think it does allow people to stay in societies. And again, we should be a beacon. I'm afraid that we're not currently, but I do think we should be a beacon for a society, a civic society, a democratic society abroad as well, which again allows people to stay. If we support non-democratic tendencies abroad, that hurts us. It comes back to us in the end.
Good point. Okay.
I would say that I had the opportunity to become friends with the current president of El Salvador, Salvador Sanchez, and after he visited Monterey County in 2013. The U.S. is in the driver's seat to really influence foreign policy because that country, for example, El Salvador, the population of more Salvadorans anywhere else outside of El Salvador is here in California. Over 1 million Salvadorans call California their home. But El Salvador is highly dependent on 2 income sources, U.S. foreign aid and remittances from their relatives in places like California back home. When I was there a few years ago, the U.S., as part of their foreign aid package, made it a requirement that their Congress needed to pass the anti-corruption for public officials, the anti-money laundering statutes, all strings attached to that U.S. foreign aid. But that government also made it a priority to help small farmers. Before they were importing a lot of their food from the outside, now the majority of the food is grown by people in their own country, so that's a strong incentive to strengthen the economy. They've also made it a big emphasis on public education, which they weren't doing previously. They only had half day, they're moving out to a full day of schooling. But programs that we consider basic are non-existent in El Salvador. Breakfast programs, free school uniforms, books and computers. They didn't have what we consider basic in the United States. They don't have those types of options in their public schools. They're moving towards that now, and a lot of that are incentives that could be made or required with our U.S. foreign aid to these Central American countries.
Thank you. Jeff?
Well, I'm very pleased to hear of the economics. I do think jobs and education and experience, being able to experience a good breakfast before class, that's very beneficial. I think there is a distinction between foreign and domestic, and that's a big driver of the difference between the two outlooks that we're talking about, the globalism and open borders versus, enforce the laws, and we're a sovereign nation. But when it comes to dealing with foreign aid, the government has a history of being very heavy-handed with its trade deals and with its favoritism. And I'm a free market guy at my core. I don't want to get into my personal story, but I think the United States has had periods of isolationism, very bad experience in Vietnam, unfortunate experience. I think still the jury is out, actually, in Iraq more than the average person does. But it's clearly our interventions are very costly to our psyche, and what are we going to do? So we have the Peace Corps. It's in the books. We send people out every year. We have the Marine Corps. We have the technology and the people that can intervene in some of these tough cases. But I think defending our sovereignty at our border and being very careful about using force, including excessive trade force, those are important. And I don't understand why we give so much money to Pakistan, just to pick on one country, or Egypt in the last 5 years. It's sort of, I get it in a geopolitical strategic sense, but man, it seems like a waste of money to me.
Okay, well, I really appreciate this has been a very interesting discussion. I usually try to end a little early so we'll have time for questions. But we've reached our 7:30 point, and what I'd actually like to request is if our speakers have the time, if you'll wait, and if anyone in the audience wants to talk to you directly, that would be good. Or maybe we'll take 2 questions from the audience. How's that? So, and I see a hand right up here, so let's go with you.
Thank you. I'll be quick. Mr. Kohler, earlier you put forth the notion that our economy, that our economic survival is dependent on having a higher population. And I reject this notion. I reject this notion because I see automation on the horizon. I see us about to have quite a few unemployed people in this country. And I'll furthermore say that it seems to run contrary to the democratic narrative about climate change, about global warming. Typically, when you have a greater population in a first world country, you have a larger carbon footprint. So I really see this as typical Democrat disingenuity.
I wouldn't go as strong, maybe I misspoke in terms of saying that our future depends, we don't have a future.
Economic survival.
Okay,
Right.
well, let's, yeah.
So I don't think, it's not as dire as that. I do think it benefits us to have immigration. And I do think that the overall, the problems that we are faced with, which are real, including, you mentioned global warming, we've talked about sort of the economic dislocation, refugees, those are things that we do need to solve. Even the water situation on the peninsula, many people think that means we cannot have more people live here. We could also just be a little more economical with the way we use our water. There's a lot of ways in which we could address some of those issues. And I'm with you that we do need to address them. I don't think that the way to address them is to shut the borders. That I reject, because I don't think it's useful. And let's face it, illegal immigration didn't exist before 1965 because it was not illegal to immigrate here. And so we've created an issue which we actually now have to deal with because we have people without papers, and that's not good for anyone. But I don't think it's quite as dire as the fact that the country wouldn't survive with more immigration. I just think it has some very, very harmful effects if we do that. So.
And that is something, though, that is part of the age of our population and the number of children, and most of the children are children of immigrants or very specific parts of the population, who will be holding up this older generation. So, one more question do we have? Or yeah.
I have a really basic question about where can just a layperson like me find the most current information about the actual numbers, like what you were talking about, about the numbers of how many immigrants are coming in, et cetera, and also there's just so much talk right now with very few facts. And I think it's very difficult to have a conversation without a baseline. So besides some of the obvious places that have information that's like 3 to 5 years old at least, what are some good places to go back to currently to get data?
So I was going to, did you add that? Well,
I
yeah,
was
so
thinking
I
person.
will say our reference librarians, actually we have some information for you.
What a good
that
idea.
we are
Use the
going to
library.
Post on the website, so we are ready with an answer
I
for
was
you.
a rambling question on there too.
No,
so
it
yes.
was a great question,
you.
and it is one
Okay.
of the, when we talk about the whole issue, with fake news these days, people are afraid of looking at what you find online and trusting it. I will tell you, your librarian is your best friend, because that's what we do. And we really do look for, and we give you multiple sources and really verify sources, so that's one of the things, but we will post that on the website. But I think Kelly has an
Well,
answer.
I read your post on Facebook, so I printed out some information
Thank you.
for you. One is from the Migration Policy Institute that I rely on a lot, and the American Immigration Council, which is a branch of the American Immigration Lawyers Association, but very objective data. So I made 10 copies of each of these for anyone who wants them, but I did that for you.
Thank you so much.
You're
Can I
welcome.
ask
What a
one
great
more
family we
question?
have, and the library will take a copy of that.
Can I ask one more question?
Okay, last question, yes.
Thank you, and it's also for Kelly. When you were talking about the prevailing wage and what employers have to go through with the visa, there is I hear a lot from people say, oh, but they don't pay as much. Is there some truth to that? That a foreign H-1 visa engineer, for example, is a lower wage than an American. I don't think so, but I hear it a lot.
No,
I'm
and
curious
it's,
about-
I guess I'll use my microphone. It's interesting because I was thinking about that a lot around the election, because you were hearing people talking about the H-1B program and saying that I had to train somebody to do my job. So, I mean, for the cases we work on, that's not true, because you have to get it certified through the Department of Labor that you're paying them the prevailing wage, and those are public access files, so anybody can go in and make sure that that's really what's happening. I think in those cases, maybe what's happening is it's not so much that they're being paid the prevailing wage and that's less. It might be that somebody's making more than the prevailing wage, and then somebody's being trained at the prevailing wage and then coming in maybe and removing that person. So they're still being paid the prevailing wage that the Department of Labor is saying they have to pay, but it's possible the prevailing wage was $15 and this person's making 20 and they got pushed out of their job by an H-1B worker. I mean, that's the only way I can see that situation would arise.
That's not a thing.
We don't see it at all with our cases, but then again, we're Silicon Valley, in
Right.
this area. So I have to believe that if people were saying that, I had to train somebody and then I had to give them my job, they're not making it up. I just couldn't put the pieces together how that worked with the H-1B program.
Do you have any idea about the data on that? What is the source?
The immigration website is actually pretty good. I would go to the USCIS website.
Okay, well, thank you all, and I really thank our panelists. Thank you so much for coming. And I will give a special thank you to Jeff. I know there was, it was hard for us to find someone who would be willing to express the conservative viewpoint, but I think you're pretty much, there's a lot of, you can see, commonality in our views and the way we
Definitely.
think, so labels don't...
I hid my third eye.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.